This episode is part of the Meet the Maker series, where we highlight an entrepreneur who is making specialty gear for ice climbers. If you've ever wanted to hear the story behind some of your favorite and soon-to-be favorite products, that's what today's conversation is about. We're doing this because we believe that thoughtfully designed gear is more than the sum of its parts. They are crafted by folks who have decades of experience in the sport, are refined through countless iterations and testing, and brought to life with genuine passion to solve real problems. Said another way, these folks represent the heart and soul of product innovation. On today's mini-episode, we talk with Doug Heinrich of Aniiu. Doug has just about done it all and seen it all in ice climbing, as both a climber and product designer. He's established many mixed climbs throughout the Wasatch, competed at the X Games, and has been at the vanguard for product at Black Diamond almost from the beginning. Before we get to our chat, there's a giveaway alert. Doug is generously offering a few pairs of their Vincent short gloves to listeners. And here's how to enter. In the conversation with Doug, be on the lookout for the answer to the following question. Takashima, a news partner, and perhaps the premier technical glove maker in Japan, are now under which generation of family ownership? Once you have the answer, head to the giveaway post on our Instagram for full details for how to submit. You can also hang around to the end where I share the steps to enter. To note, winners will be randomly selected from submissions that meet all the rules on Monday, December 2nd. So don't delay in entering. Okay, on to our conversation with Doug. Hey, Doug. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm super stoked.
We're here to talk about specialized ice climbing gloves. And along those lines, what is the elevator pitch for Aniiu?
So Aniiu, we're a specialty glove brand, and I've had the good fortune of having designed gloves for 30 plus years and designed a lot of ice climbing gloves over the years, as well as ski gloves and, whether it's backcountry or in area guide gloves, etc. But I've always felt like gloves in ice climbing are probably one of your more critical pieces of gear, because if your hands are really cold or you don't have the dexterity, you're really kind of in a tough spot. So gloves for ice climbing, specifically alpinism, alpine climbing, mountaineering a little less so, but they're really a super critical component. So it's a fun, it's just a fun project for me to, design product that kind of fits the needs of that customer and that activity. So Aniiu, I started Aniiu about 5 years ago. I was the VP of product at Black Diamond, and then I left and I went to work for Cool, which is a, sportswear brand. And so basically I teamed up with a factory that I'd worked with forever, and Black Diamond had stopped doing business with them. So kind of like the stars lined up, if that made sense. And Takashima is the name of the factory. We got together and said, hey, let's do our own brand. And so the story of Aniiu is, number one, from a sustainability perspective, Takashima has a lot of materials. I hate to say laying around, but that's probably the best way to describe it. So they have a lot of materials that either big brands that they work with, because they have 3 manufacturing facilities, one in China, one in Myanmar, and they're opening up one in Vietnam. And oftentimes big customers will cancel orders and then they're left with the raw materials. And so our number one thing was to try to repurpose those raw materials into product rather than having them tossed or just sitting around from 10 years and then eventually ending up in a landfill. So that was our number one goal. And then secondarily was to design amazing gloves. And gloves have always been a passion of mine. So the stars just lined up with Takashima. We're 50-50 partners. Like, I know much more about the design side, sort of the activity side, and they know how in my opinion, they're the best glove manufacturer in the world. They produced the original Arc'teryx gloves, which were insanely hard to make. They did Black Diamond gloves for 20 plus years until the administration here decided to part ways with them, which was a opportunity for me to, continue working with them. So that's kind of how Aniiu came around. Like, I have a passion for designing gloves, ice climbing, alpinism, all snow sports. And then Takashima was looking to partner with me to just create our own brand.
Definitely want to learn more about your partnership, multi-generational partnership with Takashima. But before we do, I want to provide a little bit more context about who you are. So I'll give some slight overview. You're a longtime Salt Lake City climber, route developer, an alpinist, among many, many, many superlatives. But could you maybe just give a little bit of context for your ice climbing history and sort of why ice climbing gloves are so important for you and of such interest?
Yeah, I would say, I grew up in Salt Lake City, so I started climbing at a really young age for that. I mean, gyms obviously didn't exist back then. So I started as an alpinist mountaineer. And when I was 12 years old, I did the Grand Teton with a friend of mine from Idaho. I actually took a train to Pocatello and he picked me up. He was 14 and they had a huge farm. And so he could drive. And so we had no idea what we were doing, to be honest, but we figured out a way to climb the Grand Teton when we were 12 and 14 years old. And I just kind of, at that point, there was no turning back for me, a life in the mountains and climbing. And I would say first and foremost, my number one passion was always being a rock climber. And then my generation of climbers, like I always wanted to be a really well-rounded climber. So I was never really great at anything, but I could do everything, at a decent level, whether it was, sport climbing 513 or crack climbing 513 or climbing A5, aid routes or mixed climbing, at M9 or 10 or whatever, or grade 6 ice. My goal was always just to be a super well-rounded climber, but I was never amazing at anything. I could just do everything. And that's kind of my generation of climbers. Like Mug Stump was one of my big mentors. Alex Lowe, I climbed with a lot. Conrad Anker and I grew up climbing together with Seth Shaw. And I think our goal, of that generation really was just to be able just to have the skills to just do lots and lots of different types of climbing in different environments. So I guess to sum it up, I've been a lifelong climber. I think the beauty of climbing is that there's just so many facets to it, so many different types of climbing that you should really never get bored because, once you quasi-master or you get proficient at one skill, you just go to the other one and it's a whole new learning process. So as far as related to gloves, like, to be honest, like in the 90s, no one was making good gloves, like the late 80s, 90s. And I basically just started making gloves for myself because I didn't like any of them. And I kind of just would cobble together gloves. And then, whether it was Alex Lowe or Seth or Conrad or anyone, we would just try them. And that just evolved into making commercial product. And obviously I've worked with Will for decades, Will Gadd, and he's always great with feedback. And same with Raphael Slavinsky. They've been on the BD team for 30 years or something. So we have really great feedback, or I've had great field testers and, people that are at the top of the sport giving feedback. But I would say the main thing with ice climbing gloves in particular is you need quite a few gloves. I would say at a minimum, you really need 4 gloves when you go out. And it really just depends on the conditions and what you're doing. Like, I swap out gloves a lot on routes. Like if I'm climbing, standard ice, I can use a bigger glove that's warmer. Obviously, everyone's climbing leashless now, thank goodness, because your hands stay a lot warmer and you can use a thinner glove because you can shake out. In the old days when people were using leashes, the leashes would kind of cut off your circulation. And so as a general rule, people were they weren't really hanging on to the tools. They were kind of letting the leash support them. And you would end up using a kind of a puffier glove with more insulation back in that era. But ever since the leashless climbing has come out, people are climbing in thinner, more dexterous gloves, which obviously makes putting screws in much faster. You're not tied to the tool like you were in the old days, etc. So I would say, the one thing with ice climbing gloves specifically is, if I'm doing a mixed pitch, I'm definitely wearing a different glove than if I'm doing standard ice. And then if I do a harder pitch, like let's just say it's like a grade 6, pillar or something, I'll usually switch to a lighter glove that I can be a bit more precise. So like I said, I think, when you're out ice climbing, you definitely want to have 3 or 4 pairs of gloves. And if you just bring a small pack, you can just reload, especially if you're climbing in Utah, where we get a lot of wet conditions here, mainly because we have pretty big temperature fluctuations. So we just have more water that's running in our areas versus like the Rockies. And so people get their gloves wet quite a lot here. So they just toss them in the bottom of the pack and pull out a new pair.
Well, speaking of 3 to 4 different types of gloves, that's generally about what you have in your lineup. And it seems like the Vincent Neo cuff, the one that has the extended cuff, is sort of the most particular to ice climbing. Do you want to talk about that? And then we can talk about the other ones.
Yeah. So the Vincent, the one issue that you have with ice climbing is you have your hands up high over your head. And a lot of times, some people will take like a base layer with a thumb loop and put it inside their glove. I've found it can kind of cut into your thumb and kind of be annoying. And then it adds a layer of bulk. And it's a good way to seal off your wrist because you want to keep your wrist warm. That's like the main place where you lose heat is in your wrist and then in your head, right? And if you've got a helmet on with a balaclava or whatever, a hat, some type of beanie, you basically, to stay warm, you want to keep your feet warm, your hands warm, and your head warm, and then the rest of your body will follow suit. So the Neo Cup was really designed to put that extended neoprene gauntlet, which would say, it stays really snug to your wrist. And advantage of that is it's a lightweight glove with an extended neocluff, so you never get that gap when you're reaching up high or swinging where there's a gap between your shell or whatever your outer layer is and the glove itself, which always happens. You either have a thumb loop that you've put inside the glove or you get that gap. There's no way around it. Like you can tighten down the Velcro as tight as you can, and I guarantee you when you get to the top of the pitch, you're going to look down and go, there's a gap there and my wrist is getting cold. So that is a very lightweight glove with that extended cuff. The disadvantage of it is it's harder to take off. So I don't really recommend that you take your gloves off very often unless you're swapping them out. So if you're used to pulling your gloves on and off all the time, you may not like that glove. And I've just sort of trained myself not to take my gloves off. Like I hardly ever take them off unless I'm at a belay and I'm swapping them out. So that's more of a learned thing over time. But the neoprene is really flexible. It keeps your wrist warm. It keeps the elements out. And again, it's a very lightweight, supple glove that has, a really good tactile feel for gripping the tools and putting screws in easily.
Maybe I'm incorrect, but I believe I read that the neoprene, because it's a little bit tighter fit, it can kind of act like a compression sleeve or sock.
For sure. Yep, absolutely. So it just, the main thing is there's a little bit of protection there, right, for your wrist. And then secondarily, it just keeps that whole area really warm. And the neoprene's pretty stretchy too. So I can actually stretch it over like a hard shell if I want to put it on the outside. I typically run it on the inside, but you can stretch it over if you want to. Obviously, you're not going to stretch it over at Summit Park or something like that. But most people are running their gloves as a general rule under their cuff. It's just a cleaner system. And, that's one kind of tech tip I would give, beginners is just make sure you're really organized and have a really clean system. You don't want a bunch of straps and dangling stuff because you just end up tying yourself in knots. I mean, ice climbing is complicated enough and you just want a really clean system. You want to use ice clippers for your screws. You want to be really organized because putting screws in sometimes can be really difficult unless you're on a good stance. And so you really just want to be organized and kind of plan that out. And I would say gloves is absolutely critical to that function. Like if you have crappy gloves that are too loose and rolly and the palm isn't tight, you're going to struggle to hang on to your tools and put screws in.
Actually, one of the things I've struggled with is sizing. And I just got rid of a pair because the thumb was too tight. And any time that I would go into cool conditions, it would actually force circulation out. My thumb would be much colder than the rest of the hand. So do you have any suggestions for actually how to size gloves?
Yeah, it's kind of personal preference. Like we size them on the number grade, so kind of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, in that system. So we end up having kind of tweener sizes to get it right. So we end up with like a small medium and a medium large, which surprisingly is a lot of people end up with it. Guys end up with an ML, and sometimes women end up with a something in between an extra small and a small. So you can dial in your fit a little better because our grading's a bit tighter than the standard, alpha sizing, small, medium, large, XL. So that's one advantage. But we use leather palms on our gloves. So, we like the goat leather because it's really tough. It's really supple. You can hang on to your tools better than synthetics. They don't freeze. It doesn't freeze like a lot of the synthetic palms do. And I typically will size my gloves a little tight out of the box, but then they'll kind of stretch to fit. Now, I will say the fit kind of accelerates climbing in Utah because we get our gloves wet a lot. And so they kind of custom form to your hand when you get them soaked. They almost mold to your hand. If you're climbing in really dry, cold conditions, I think that you could probably size up, a half a size or something. It really, gloves are tricky, right? Because like you say, like the main goal is to keep your hands warm, but you also have to have them pretty dexterous. And I'd say the pro tip there is like when you're climbing leashless, you want to drop your hands a lot and shake out to keep your circulation going, and don't over grip your tools, So I think all those little tips over time will really help keep your hands warmer. But I think shaking out is probably the number one, just getting your hands below your waist, shaking them out when you're in a good spot, and then, grabbing back onto your tool and continuing up the route.
So we talked about the Vincent, but you have other gloves in your product line. So do you want to just talk to the other gloves that you offer?
Yeah, so we have a whole Vincent series of gloves. For fall 23, the Vincents will still be available. I don't want to jump down a PFAS rabbit hole, but we repurposed some fabric that had C6 DWR on it. And so we actually discontinued the Vincent family and we moved it into the Tyree family just because it's PFC free. The whole OSA family is PFC free already. A lot of the Vincents are, but since we repurpose fabric, we have to test everything. And so that's why we chose to rechange the name. So for fall 24, the Vincents will move to the Tyrees, which I know is a little confusing, but it's not that confusing because our line's pretty small. And that was mainly just due to the PFAS regulations that are coming. But so we basically have the Vincents, which are made out of like burlier materials. They'll take some more abuse. And then the OSAs are using a lightweight ripstop. So I would say a combination of both is really a good. If you're not going to be in a high abrasion zone and you just want a lightweight, warmer, puffy glove, the OSA is a good way to go. They compress better, they pack better, but they're not as tough. So again, one of them's using a pretty burly stretch woven fabric, and then the other one's using a lightweight ripstop. I kind of mix them both. Like I typically bring a pair of OSA mitts as a belay mitt just because they're lighter and you can compress them easier. But then when I'm climbing, I use the Aniiu cuffs or the Vincent Lights, which is basically the Vincent Lights, just a non-Aniiu cuff version of the Vincent Aniiu cuff, if that makes sense. So you kind of have your choice. Do you like the cuff or do you not like the cuff?
Just for the listener who might not be able to visualize it, the cuff just extends maybe to mid forearm, I think.
Yep, it's pretty long and it has a really lightweight zipper in it. The zipper's pretty burly, and obviously you can blow up zippers if you try to, but if you're just normal use, like I've used them for 2 full years without wrecking the zipper, so I'm not too worried about it. And I'm also not trying to zip it over like 5 layers, and you know what I mean? You just have to be smart when you're using these things.
We talked about your partnership with Takashi earlier, and you have quite an extended relationship with the owners. Actually, now it spans 2 generations. So do you want to talk about what it means to you to be able to work with this company and father-son duo?
So Takashima started in the 30s, Japanese manufacturing principles. It's actually June is the third generation, which is pretty cool. So I never had the chance to meet the original founder, but I met his son, Kenzo. And when I was designing gloves for Black Diamond for many, many years, Takashima was our single source. And we developed, all the incredible gloves like the Guide Glove and the Mercury Met top sellers, etc. over the years with Takashima. And then, like I said, Black Diamond parted ways with Takashima about 6 years ago, just due to the administration here, had some ties with different glove factories, which at that time I was pretty upset about it, but it also opened up an opportunity for me to partner with them with Aniiu. So, that was kind of a cool serendipitous thing that kind of popped out of that, if that makes sense. Yeah, Takashima, third generation glove manufacturer. That's all they do is gloves. And they're arguably the best glove manufacturer in the world. I would call them a high-end boutique glove manufacturer. They don't make like high volume, cheap gloves. They really work on, complicated, hard to make, super high quality gloves. And we're 50-50 partners. Jun, who is the son of Kenzo. So Kenzo Takashima, took it over from his father, and he ran the business for 40 plus years. And then he turned the business over to Jun. He's been running it for the last 5 or 6 years. And Jun actually went to the University of Utah, and he got his finance degree. And then he went back to China and took over, the family business. So that's kind of the story. So yeah, Takashima has 3 facilities. So 3 manufacturing facilities. They have one in China that they've had for many, many years. They have one in Myanmar that's over a decade old. And then they have a new facility in Vietnam. So that's kind of how they're set up at this point from a manufacturing perspective. We have some info on our website on them. I mean, they're really, really amazing to their staff. And, that's really important to me to provide, a really good living for people, to be quite honest, that are born in pretty tough circumstances, like a place like Myanmar. Some people will say, oh, you shouldn't support, Myanmar. And it's like, well, what about the people that live there that they don't have Visa cards or Amex cards where they can just get on an airplane and relocate? We need to be cognizant of people and are in pretty tough spots. And these are really good jobs for those individuals. So I have a lot of passion for protecting those workers, making sure that they can make a good livelihood. They make amazingly quality product. They're super dedicated. And, Takashima has about 300 workers in Myanmar. So it's not insignificant, the impact that they're making.
So I was reading on your website that the business is employee owned, or you want it to be employee owned. So I was wondering, why is that important to you?
I just feel like, when people dedicate their time and energy into anything, whatever it is, I think when people have equity in something, they're just all in, right? So as we grow as an organization, we're tiny right now. I mean, it takes time to create a business, to get off the ground, to create the product. But as we grow and we add employees, I just want to make sure that they have stake in the company. And I just think it's a really important thing to keep people motivated, committed. And at the end of the day, like, if Aniiu grows to be a much bigger company, that will be material for those people that have helped it grow, if that makes sense. So it goes beyond just a paycheck, that they actually have equity in the company. And that's just really important to me as a business owner.
The gloves sound awesome, but obviously being able to see them in person and try them on and figure out your fit is important. So where can people see your gloves, and are you doing any festivals this winter?
Liberty Mountain is our distributor for North America, and they're an amazing partner. So we're feel really fortunate that Liberty has us as an exclusive brand for them. So you can definitely check out the gloves on, the Liberty Mountain website. You can check out the gloves on Aniiu.com. That's ANIIU.com. And that's the name of our penguin, by the way. So it doesn't really mean anything other than that's our penguin's name. And our tagline's your friend in the cold. But now that we have 2 reps out helping push the Aniiu gloves into the specialty channel, you'll see them more available. We will be at the Bozeman Ice Festival and then also at Ouray, and we'll be with Liberty there. And then I believe that Liberty will also be at the Michigan Ice Festival, but at a minimum, we will be at Ouray, Bozeman, and then Michigan.
Thanks so much, Doug, for chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you reaching out, and I'm really stoked that you're, getting this the Ice beta podcast off the ground. I mean, you're spreading the love of ice climbing, which I'm really stoked about.
I really appreciate it. No, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
As I said earlier, Doug is generously offering a few pairs of their Vincent short gloves to listeners. That's you. Here's how to enter. These are the full details. Once you have the answer to the question, follow Aniiu gloves, Aniiu_gloves, and Ice Beta on Instagram. DM the answer to the questions to us, Ice Beta, on Instagram. Comment on the giveaway post on our Instagram. The comment that you should leave is #yourfriendinthecold once you sent in your answer via DM. Share the giveaway post to your story for an extra entry, and like I said earlier, winners will be randomly selected from submissions on Monday, December 2nd. Now, if you want a 100% chance of snagging a pair of gloves, you can check out Aniiu's full lineup at aniiu.com. That is Aniiu.com.